Ci ha mostrato che è possibile combinare rigore scientifico, impegno civico e passione in un modo originale e unico. Era molto esigente, lo sappiamo noi che l'abbiamo conosciuto e frequentato a lungo, con se stesso prima di tutto, ma anche con gli altri. Tuttavia era capace di comprendere i limiti e le debolezze di tutti e quindi alla fine probabilmente era molto più accomodante e conciliante di quello che forse avrebbe voluto essere. Era mite e mostrava una grande umanità, due caratteri della sua personalità che tutti riconoscevano subito e apprezzavano in modo particolare. Però sapeva anche essere fermo e risoluto, soprattutto sulle questioni di principio e quelle di responsabilità istituzionale verso la collettività. Su questo era molto meno accomodante, anche se cercava sempre di smorzare i toni e di mantenere un atteggiamento pacato. Quindi sicuramente è stato ed è ancora, come dicevo, un esempio e un modello. Oggi lo ricordiamo in modi diversi. Come avete visto dal programma ci sono due sessioni, la prima più accademica in inglese, la seconda più personale, ma ovviamente ringrazio tutti quelli che sono qui oggi per discutere insieme a noi, per ricordare Lorenzo, ma anche per discutere dei temi, come dicevo, che lo appassionavano. Steven Bach, che farà la relazione iniziale, e poi chi seguirà prendendo spunti da questa relazione, ma anche dalla lunga frequentazione con Lorenzo, Beppe Della Rocca e Anna Mori. Poi avremo invece un'altra sessione, come dicevo, un po' più personale, ma anche qui ciascuno evidentemente la interpreterà come crede sia giusto, importante, bello per certi aspetti ricordare Lorenzo in questa occasione. E quindi avremo i ricordi di Mimmo Carrieri, di Gianprimo Cella e di Ida Regalia. Ovviamente è anche l'occasione per tutti noi di intervenire, se vogliamo, con qualsiasi cosa, sia in questa sala, sia da remoto. Come direttore del Dipartimento do a tutti e a tutte il benvenuto, porto anche i saluti del Rettore che ha conosciuto e apprezzato Lorenzo soprattutto quando era presidente del nucleo di valutazione. Oggi non può essere con noi, però mi ha detto e mi ha pregato di portare i suoi saluti alla famiglia e ovviamente a tutti quelli che oggi sono qui per ricordare Lorenzo. Bene, non voglio rubare altro tempo alle due sessioni, abbiamo già preso qualche minuto per attendere l'arrivo delle persone, quindi darei la parola subito a Steven Bach. Now we turn to English. So thank you, Steven, for being here today and to give, I would say, the main talk this morning in the academic session.
Thank you.
Please. Yeah, the floor is yours. I'll just turn to your presentation. Should be there, and I will also share it with our. Yes, please.
Benedetta, Bengiamino, Giovanni, Pietro, dear friends and colleagues. It's a great honor and privilege to be with you today, as well as a very sad and somber occasion for us all. I participated in many seminars in this room over the years. I do remember on one occasion, I think Lorenzo was having a very animated discussion with a number of people late in the day, and they came and turned the lights off because I think they wanted us to come out of the discussion. I'll do my best to do justice to the friend and collaborator I worked with for more than a quarter of a century. Any omissions are, of course, my own. And I appreciate that the family has shared some wonderful photos with us today that I will draw on. I will speak in English because I'm afraid my Italian is rather rudimentary. So my comments will cover Lorenzo's career briefly. Then I will focus on his academic contributions to the field of industrial relations that extended well beyond the public sector, say a little bit about our collaborations, and end with a few personal reflections. Lorenzo was born in Como after the war and attended school in Como and spent much of his life there. After school, he went to study sociology at the University of Trento and graduated with the highest distinction, summa cum laude, in the early 70s. He went on to undertake a prestigious Italian National Research Council fellowship, and this was a very turbulent period in European society. Demands for social reform in France precipitated student unrest and strikes, which spread from France to Italy in the hot autumn of 1968. In the early 1980s, Lorenzo spent a formative period at Harvard. I wasn't sure if that was taken then or later, actually. And then at MIT, funded by several prestigious foundations. At Harvard, he was based at the Center for European Studies, and the period ignited his interest in comparative industrial relations and the societies in which they were bedded. And this remained an enduring passion throughout his career. In this period, he gained a research-focused assistant professorship at the University of Trento in economic sociology, and subsequently moved to Brescia in the late 1980s. In 2002, he moved to the University of Milan and was subsequently awarded a full professorship in economic sociology. He remained there until he nominally retired at the end of 2020. Retirement allowed a bit more time with his family and grandchildren and on the tennis court, but it did not slow down his prodigious output or willingness to encourage and nurture colleagues. In addition to his research, which I will say more about shortly, he made a large number of contributions to academic life. He was a very active and committed educator and oversaw MSc programs and mentored and supported many colleagues' careers, such as Anna sitting next to me. He was also head of department for many years. And in my view, and I speak as someone who's been a faculty dean for 5 years, the head of department role, as Roberto knows, is the hardest and at times some of the most, one of the most thankless jobs in the academy. I suppose you have that classic middle management dilemma. Not only do you sit uncomfortably between your colleagues and the higher echelons of university administration, who of course are always wrong, but you have to keep your colleagues content, or at least not very unhappy. Lorenzo gracefully undertook a long stint of academic service. So let me turn to his scholarship and the contribution that is connected strongly to the question of the puzzle or puzzles of employment relations in public administration. There are many puzzles, but I want to pick out a number that informed Lorenzo's work that I will return to. The most fundamental puzzle is the seemingly simple question of what is public employment. And this is a key question with differing definitions. Is it the activity itself, public administration, such as education, health, the military, or is ownership the key question? And as we know, ownership of public services has become more fluid over recent decades as the boundaries of the state have changed through outsourcing and renationalisation, and some outsourcing and insourcing. So even if an activity is in the private sector, the regulatory reach and influence of the state is still very strong. So ownership patterns can influence employment contracts, scope for collective bargaining, and the right to strike. So here we see some of Lorenzo's work, and he, very forensically analysed the size and shape of the public sector. And you can see very different conclusions can be reached about the size of the public sector, depending on which definition that you use of the public sector. So that's very important. And of course, often the public sector is criticised for being too large, too unproductive, too inefficient. So again, the size of the public sector is very important. So Lorenzo undertook, as we see here, a lot of work for the European Commission, analysing and categorising different countries' public sector and looking at key characteristics. The second puzzle of public administration is to understand the logic of public sector employment relations and the role of the state in shaping employment relations directly and indirectly. In one sense, there is widespread agreement that the logic of action in the public sector differs from the private sector. It derives from the unique role of the state as an employer, with frequently conflicting roles that the state plays as an employer, as a regulator, as a financer of public services, and as a policymaker. The state within the bargaining process is therefore simultaneously the employer who seeks to recruit and retain its workforce, while also responsible for raising revenue to reward its workforce. The policymaker, responsible for sound finance and economic growth, and the regulator of industrial relations. And as I left England yesterday, these issues were being played out. Nurses, railway workers, university lecturers, civil servants, all on strike. And I know you have a general strike here today. And of course, the government is saying more wages for the public sector, more inflation, less growth. So therefore, the public sector, as Lorenzo described here, is invariably imbued with a political logic that Lorenzo summarized here. And some writers in the 60s and 70s, like Wellington and Winter, argued that collective bargaining in the public sector undermined democracy because it gave one interest group, public sector workers, a kind of veto right over the political process through collective bargaining. So Lorenzo was extremely well read and was aware of these analyses. But this analysis of distinctiveness, as he recognized, could only be a starting point, not an end point. It does not enable us to explain one of Lorenzo's great interests, understanding why the system of public sector employment relations regulation varies very significantly between countries. In some countries, excuse me, in some countries, legal regulation and a tendency towards unilateral action by the state is dominant, as in Central and Eastern Europe. Whilst in others, collective bargaining is permitted, such as in the Nordic countries or Britain or Italy, but often accompanied by restrictions on strike action. Lorenzo therefore devoted much time and made a very large contribution to understanding public sector comparative industrial relations. And he generated many insights into how public sector employment relations actually function in different countries. His explanations always recognized the key role of the state, of trade unions and employers, but also the historical and institutional context shaping the dynamics of industrial relations. So to summarize, we have the puzzle of the definition of the public sector, and we also have the puzzle of the logic of the public sector, how the economic and the political operate together, and how sometimes they are in conflict with each other. And I see a clear line of sight between Lorenzo's earlier work on state action applied to different state regimes, his interest in strikes and strikes in essential services, and his later work on the public sector. So if we turn to the state, with Prima, who's here today, Lorenzo was very focused and interested in the logic of state action and in what ways political interventions by the state differed from interventions by industrial relations actors. And he identified that state action in politics has a majoritarian logic underpinned by an electoral mandate. In other words, governments ultimately can impose change. But in industrial relations, it's different. There has to be a degree of approval by both parties, employers and trade unions, however grudging that consent may be. So there may be conflict between these two logics of action. And in this important article, Lorenzo and his colleagues drew out what that logic was and what the implications were. This was an essential item on my reading list because it challenged Anglo-Saxon and American views of industrial relations that argued that in Britain and America, the state was not very involved in industrial relations. Britain was described as a voluntarist system where the state delegated authority to employers and trade unions. But Lorenzo showed that that was fundamentally incorrect. And he argued that the state had four functions that it promoted in industrial relations. The first one was promotion, where the state could encourage particular forms of behavior. For example, in the 1960s, the Kennedy government allowed civil servants to organize in the federal government, a position of promotion. Secondly, the state could exclude actors and prohibit trade unions or limit the functioning of trade unions. Thirdly, the state could correct by prohibiting or changing terms and conditions, or making mediation in public services, conciliation, compulsory. And finally, definition, when the state defined the role of the social partners. So the conclusion was that in all systems, even voluntarist systems, the state had a very active role in driving the behavior of industrial relations actors, as is described here. This work on the state connected to his work on strikes and conflict. And this was, again, an enduring contribution that Lorenzo made on strikes and conflict and on the limits of the pluralist model of industrial relations. The idea that unions and employers could self-regulate the employment relationship. Next. Yes. So this paper here, again, a very influential paper, looked at strike trends in 7 countries and the United States. And it very much challenged the view of Ross and Hartman that strikes were withering away. And one of the important contributions here was Lorenzo pointed to the issue of tertiarization of strikes. That is the idea that strikes were shifting from manufacturing and coal mining to service industries, like the public sector. But what Lorenzo argued was that this was not just a quantitative shift, but it was an important qualitative shift in behavior. Firstly, because strike action in the public sector is very different. As we're discussing today, it affects citizens, whether we can get to work, whether we can get to, get to the office. So citizens are impacted. Secondly, it affects sheltered sectors. So a lot of the theories of strikes make a link between the economic cycle and strike action. But Lorenzo pointed out that in the public sector, that's not such a consideration because they are not so impacted by the economic cycle. And thirdly, they could be divisive and sectionless. It could encourage strong groups like doctors or teachers to set up their own independent trade unions, which Lorenzo did a lot of important work on, which could reduce the solidarity of the union movement overall. So this work on public sector strikes also led to a strong interest, work he did with Linda Dickens and others on strike resolution in the public services. Very important work there. In this work and in many other areas of his scholarship, Lorenzo was also testing out the strengths and weaknesses of the pluralist model of industrial relations. As I said before, the idea that employers and unions could self-regulate. But if citizens are affected, then maybe that model is not so effective. And that's why he made such an important contribution academically and in policy to, public sector strike mediation and resolution. So let me turn to his work on the public sector. It's very rare that a scholar is known for multiple contributions across many domains. As well as his work on the state and strikes, he also wrote extensively about the private sector, the textbook with Roberto on European integration. And he was prolific in his outputs. His ability to work with quantitative and qualitative data, his ability to combine industrial sociology and insights from institutional economics were very, very rare. It was a very rare gift. In the public sector, I see two major contributions. The first was to challenge the prescriptions, the policy recipes around the new public management. Crudely, new public management suggested that policy and practice in the private sector, management practice, should be applied to the public sector. Now, Lorenzo was very open to new ideas and innovation. He was very critical in some ways of the public sector, but he also understood what could be effective and what could not be effective in application in the public services. So he criticized new public management's excessive emphasis on individual incentives, like individual performance-related pay, and its neglect of forms of collectivism amongst managers, employers, and trade unions that shape the culture and context in which policies are implemented. So Lorenzo was skeptical of the language of transformation, irreversible change. After the economic crisis, he did not believe there would be an irreversible change in the public sector. So in this 2008 European Journal article, he demonstrated the naivety of many of the prescriptions for public sector employment relations reform. So he criticized the new public management, but he showed that the outcomes of new public management reform were much more mixed, with many unintended consequences that people had ignored. And he argued, going back to where I came in, that these stem from the neglect of the political and distinctive nature of the public sector. And as he says in the article, an excessive attention to moral hazard and agency costs. The idea that you have a principal, a head teacher, a chief executive of a hospital who imposes their will on the agents, the workers, the other managers. He thought that was naive. So to put it another way, this literature focuses on the shirking and opportunistic behavior of the public sector workforce. But it failed to consider that it could be the principals, the head teachers, the hospital managers, the municipality managers, who could collude and work with local trade unions to transfer higher pay costs onto higher levels of government. So it was not the opportunism of the agents, but it was the weakness of the principles that is a major concern. That was a very important and very rich insight. But he also argued for more, positive measures of change. We used to talk a lot about the pay review bodies in the UK, which was something he was very interested in. And just finally, one other contribution, it was an article we wrote together in 2011. He also argued that the new public management, the reform movement, argued that there were leaders, first movers, early adopters, and then those who came later. And he said, again, this is very naive because there are different models of public sector employment and workforce that is not captured by this analysis. So his second major contribution was very much about comparing and contrasting the public sector in different countries. Maybe next slide. And this is when I first got, if I say a little bit, when I first got to know Lorenzo. And it was his work on the public sector that cemented a very long collaboration and friendship from the 1990s. When I showed this photo to my daughter earlier this week, I'm in the green shirt. She said, "You still have that shirt." Yeah. So Lorenzo and I shared an interest in understanding how public services were being modernized, understanding and comparing public services. And we had many, beautiful locations, fantastic hospitality in Como and elsewhere. So as well as being critical of the new public management, we were also dissatisfied that the new public management, next slide, didn't actually look very much at the impact of the new public management reforms on the workforce, on employers, on the workforce. So this is what a number of the things that we did together over many years, we looked at the variation between countries, why countries vary. Lorenzo developed a rich analysis as that between them. And as well as in the second book, we added on Central and Eastern Europe. As well as these and other comparative projects, Lorenzo and I, for many years, organized the Industrial Relations, the Global Industrial Relations Association Public Sector Study Group. We met in Cape Town and elsewhere. It was a great opportunity to bring people together from all over the world. Lorenzo served on the executive committee. He presented a keynote in Manchester and Cape Town. He was very much in demand from his colleagues, the ILO, the European Commission, many, many other organizations. So let me finish with a few more personal reflections. As we all know, Lorenzo was a very special person. He had many, many qualities. He was taken from us far too soon. He was modest, self-effacing. He was very magnanimous, as well as being very hardworking, rigorous. He was quite driven, I would say, intellectually confident and very well read. He was curious about people, ideas, and wider society. And beyond his work, as you know, his family was incredibly important to him. He took huge pride in your achievements. He often talked to me about your careers and what you were doing. Yeah, he was also an accomplished skier. Although sadly we never got the chance to ski together. So I first met Lorenzo at Warwick University in the mid-1990s. And yeah, he was a very generous, warm person. He thought deeply about the challenges of our field, and we worked together very strongly. And over the course of the century that I knew and worked with him, he never lost his huge intellectual curiosity, not only about industrial relations, about politics, democracy, the labor movement, all sorts of subjects, art, literature, very interested in the European Union, explained a lot to me about Italian politics. But now we've overtaken you in Britain in the craziness. And on the day of the Brexit outcome, he got in touch with me to commiserate and reflect on the future of Europe without Britain. And it was a very typical gesture that Lorenzo did. So let me finish by saying, even though Lorenzo has left us far too soon, we at least can be grateful for the legacy he has left us as a friend, a scholar, and as a teacher. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen, for this overview of the many and diverse contributions that Lorenzo gave us, and by stressing the original combination of different theoretical perspectives with a very strong attention to empirical evidence that made him and us reflect upon the different puzzles of employment relations and in the public administration. Thank you. Thank you, Stephen. Now we can move on, and I would leave the floor to Beppe Della Rocca, and then we will hear from Anna. No, it's already on. Yes. You maybe just have to get a bit closer, and then it should be okay.
Thank you, Stephen, for the beautiful presentation, not only of the work, but the life of Lorenzo. What I'm saying is much more narrow, but your presentation, obviously. And I see, looking at.
Can you maybe
Is this one?
Listen.
It works, but.
You should say closer, yeah, thank you. And I will talk about him, I will say something about him. I will say something about him. That is okay, okay. Is about him like a friend, but like a people, a person that we discuss a lot. About the title of this seminar, that is the puzzle of employment relation in the public administration. With Lorenzo always discuss the two sides of the problem, of two problems. The one is the puzzle of employment relation. The other one is the enigma of the public administration. That are two different things in which industrial relation play a second role. And he was very aware of this, like Stephen said. But say something about the puzzle of labor relation. A puzzle was about quasi-market and mandatory regulation, as Stephen said. The term puzzle has always been part of the Lorenzo studies of industrial relation from 1944. That I think was the his first book about industrial relation in the public sector. The Italian title is Pluralismo senza mercato, rappresentanza e conflitti nel settore pubblico. That in English is without, pluralism without market, representation and conflict in the public sector. That is the puzzle. According to Lorenzo, the new system of labor relation had all the components of private industrial relation, collective bargaining with the right to strike, trade union negotiation, a plurality of worker representation, autonomous authority representing employer. However, all those aspects lacked a market regulation in comparison to the comparative collective relation in the private sector. That is the puzzle, in some way. The new principle of right for public work did not replace what are normally associated with the public sectors, but were introduced in addition to them. So private regulation, sort of private regulation, new public management, were introduced in a system of public regulation, state regulation. Especially what this was in Italy. Not in all the countries, like now I am talking about Italy, in fact. Therefore, in the Italian public sector, a dual system was affirmed, which was the sum of public rights and those ensured by collective autonomy, like Gino Giugni and Rusciano said in the 90s. And that is the fundamental dilemma of the public sector. Along this dilemma, Lorenzo defined a temporal scanning of the dilemmas between quasi-market and the one-side regulation of public power. That was during all his studies. And just to remember to you, the first scan is first privatization, 94, 95. Second privatization, 97, 99, in which there was a sort of privatization that arrived in 99 with the stand of the autonomy of the public administration to negotiate on the basis of their own resources. And that was the top of the change. That remains now the top of this sort of change. Bach, soon after, the year after, to public discipline, freezing the law, freezing reduction of the role of collective bargaining. Return the last year to decentralized wage bargaining in 2014. The wage increase, but even now, the wage increase is integrated with the administration of the budget cycle under the control of the Court of Accounts. This is the puzzle. The second problem at the second stage is the enigma in all this story, all this history of the public administration. An important discussion with Lorenzo was the reform of public administration. In fact, Lorenzo studies took a part in a process of institutionalization of the discovery of civil society by the state, in which an effective citizen organization as well as collective bargaining should be considered an important part. Remember, just from the state as a function, the state as a services. Lorenzo took part of this project, not sometimes not directly, but in the last period, he was very keen on this point. There are people that I want just to quote here, is that we refer to them was Saverio Giannini in '86. The famous word, the organizational Babylon of the Italian state, or an organization of the state without transparency and clear administrative accountability. That's from people that use most of this word were Carlo della Ringa and Massimo D'Antona. This is the other side. And the questions of this side that he posed, he did, are mainly three. Did the new employment relation system allow an effective state ahead in the organizational reform of the public administration? Let's say, remember, people here, that the collective bargaining was a state towards a reform of the public administration, was a part of it. And the question is, did all this done something? The second question is, was the organizational structure of administration able to accomplish the tradition of a contractual employer regulation? And the third question, autonomy, decentralization, individual differentiation of wages of public employee were possible in a system with a lack of accountability and result. What we suffer nowadays is just this, the lack of accountability. We use different words like new public management, the question of incentive, the question of payment by result, individual payment result. The idea of the intersystem of employment result was the sum of payment by result will lead to the reform of the public administration. That doesn't happen, but not only because of the instrument used in the field of industrial relations, but because of the organization of the state. That still now, until now, we are talking here, you see, which the discussion is which are the objective and the result of the plan that European state wanted from Italy, with a lot of money invested, but with no result until now, even in the preparation of the plan, still are not clear, you see. Thank you very much. Thank you to all of you which listen to me very well.
Thank you, Beppe. Now, please, Anna, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm honored and quite moved to have the chance to take part in this seminar. I wish to first express my gratitude to Roberto for taking care of the organization of this seminar and to all the speakers who kindly accepted to join us here in Milan. A warm thank you goes to all the participants who are sharing this morning with us, both online and in presence, especially in presence, despite the national strike in the transport sector. The timing coincidence is certainly annoying, but also symbolic. I like to think that it somehow pays a tribute to Lorenzo's elaboration in the industrial conflict in the tertiary sector, especially in the transport one. And many thanks to Stephen for your inspiring and touching speech, in which you brilliantly depicted a comprehensive portrait of Lorenzo's seminal work, of his career, his life, as well as of his influential contribution offered to both the Italian and the international debate in comparative employment relations, not only in the public sector, despite this is an area where he concentrated the most during the second half, I would say, of his career when I met him. Yet in my role as a discussant, however, I am well aware that I have to cope with some difficulties, in particular, 3 levels of complexity. First level of complexity. Discussing Lorenzo's work and scientific contribution is a hard task for me. Lorenzo is an exemplary scholar. Over the course of a career of more than 40 years, he has constantly combined rigorous attention to theoretical argumentations and implication with a search for a systematic connection between theoretical elaboration and empirical evidence in the analysis of the socioeconomic phenomena he investigated. As a graduate student first, and then as a doctoral student, postdoctoral fellow, and then finally researcher, I benefited and learned a lot from his analytical and theoretical rigor and from his way of approaching this job. Second level of complexity, say something meaningful about Stephen's speech presenting Lorenzo's work further complicates my job and this picture. Stephen experienced a long-standing and fruitful collaboration with Lorenzo in several research European projects and publications, alongside, as he said, a constant and frequent exchange of view. Their joint work lucidly and timely intercepted, from a comparative perspective, the main trajectories of transformation in public sector employment relations under major exogenous pressure and shocks, which include, for instance, as both Beppe and Stephen said, the spread of new public management paradigms across European public administration since the 90s, that was then published in a special issue in the International Journal of Human Resource Management, the impact of the financial crisis and the new EU economic governance, published again in another special issue in the European Journal of Industrial Relations 2013, and the development and the reform of public administration during the recovery phase in the aftermath of the crisis. All in all, this seminal contribution shared the value of having offered comprehensive, critical, and always theoretical anchored analytical lenses to understand the specific dynamics of change and reform taking place in public services and employment relations, considered distinctive, as Stephen said, from those occurring in the private sector of the economy. Once again, I've benefited a lot from these frameworks, which constituted actually the theoretical framework of my doctoral research. Third level of complexity, but I'm managing quite well, saying something meaningful about Stephen's contributions, presenting Lorenzo's work, and doing it without trying not to get too emotional. It's especially hard. Under different circumstances, I would have spoken without just following a few slides without having to read. But on other occasions, I had collected enough empirical evidence demonstrating that the risk of getting emotional is especially high. So I prefer just to write down every single word. So after all these premises, I just want to try to say something and to touch some of the topics that Stephen mentioned regarding Lorenzo's work. And as Lorenzo's last doctoral candidate, I have prepared to orient my look forward rather than backward, focusing on the potential future perspectives and pathways of research that Lorenzo's legacy could inspire. In particular, I attempted to figure out what could have been his research agenda under the current socioeconomic circumstances concerning two interrelated topics that have occupied a prominent position in his studies on the public sector and that Stephen mentioned: the changing role of the state and the trajectory of transformation of employment relations in the public sector. So starting from the role of the state, I will take a different perspective from those that Stephen mentioned regarding Lorenzo's work. Regarding the role of the state, Lorenzo's studies have great merit, among others, of being grounded on a crucial assumption, recognized, as Stephen said, importantly, that the state is a peculiar actor. The state, in fact, within its national boundaries, traditionally play a unique role and a multiple role, being at the same time the public employer, the policymaker, the legislator, the financier, and the provider of public and essential services. Moving from this premise, Lorenzo has concentrated his research attention on the changing nature of the role of the state in its guise, for instance, of public employer, underlying the political nature of this role, and its guise of the regulator in the industrial relations sphere, and through regulator through industrial relations, as elaborated in the article with Gianprimo, where they provided an account of the repertoire of roles that the state plays in the realm of industrial relations. In this sense, the role of the state has evolved through different phases in Europe during the post-war history. During the golden age of the active Keynesian state, the state took an unprecedented role in the governance and regulation of domestic markets through active and fiscal and industrial policy, in the expansion of welfare programs and state bureaucracies, as well as in the regulation of industrial relations, generally through direct or indirect promotion intervention. While the deepening of the European regulatory state, the spread of new public management paradigm, and the increasing globalization of product and financial markets, nation-state authority was instead increasingly challenged since the 80s. These developments took place in a context dominated by the rhetoric promoting efficiency and savings, by shrinking public employment, marginalizing the direct role of the state, as well as hollowing out its responsibility to entrust leeway to market-driven dynamics and set adjustments. Paradoxically, whereas the centrality of the state seemed to be gradually eroded in certain spheres, the importance of state intervention for industrial relations was evident with opposing approaches. While in some countries, like in the UK, it primarily consisted in the adoption of restriction and exclusion action to curb the power of collective organization and to deregulate employment relations. In others, it intervened with measures to correct goals and to select actors. Elaborating on this argument and moving to recent events, the global financial crisis first and the pandemic emergency later have once again demonstrated the state centrality in the governance of our contemporary societies and markets. Over the last decade, the state has thus witnessed a comeback as a provider of public goods, essential services, and social protection in hard times, generating a renewed interest and a reconsideration of its key role in today's European economies. Furthermore, the disruption of the energy market caused by the Russian invasion of Ukraine has forced European states to experiment all the new ways to regulate the process of wage and price formation across the economy. In this vein, drawing on Lorenzo's contribution, further future research could be oriented to examining to what extent and in what ways the accumulation of these successive shocks and crises has brought about a new role or a new centrality for the state autonomy and for the state authority in its multifold and multi-level functions. What kind of interventions for industrial relations can we expect to observe over the next years among the repertoire suggested by Bordogna and Cella, 1999, to tackle the ongoing financial and inflationary pressure? What kind of politics of inflation management will the European states adopt with regard to industrial relations instruments? What kind of approach towards social partners and especially organized labor the state will display in the governance of the current crisis? These are some of the questions that might drive our future research agenda, drawing on Lorenzo's legacy. Coming to the second point, the last point, and connected to the previous one, a second seminal contribution Lorenzo's work offered to the field of study of the public sector and public administration from an industrial relation perspective concern the examination of the main trajectories of transformation in public sector employment relations system across the EU countries under the pressure, as I mentioned at the beginning, of different common transversal exogenous pressure. New public management, again, the financial crisis, the EU economic governance imposed to states. In his joint research with Stephen, they offered a fundamental framework to understand the specific dynamics of change taking place in the public services and employment relations, which they recognize as a distinctive arena, and this is especially important, compared to the private sector, dominated and governed by different actors and specific logics. The distinctive role played by the state has historically shaped the country's specific setting and their distinctiveness from the private sector. Elaborating on this premise, they empirically corroborated the idea that the distinctive national institutional configuration of public administration and public sector labor regulation play a crucial role in shaping country-specific trajectories of reform and employment relation dynamics by mediating the repercussion of exogenous and endogenous financial shocks and organizational reshuffles. Furthermore, through their comparative work, Lorenzo and Stephen contributed to an animated back and forth debate that has contrasted a neoliberal convergent pattern with enduring differences in the dynamics of transformation of employment relation regimes across advanced capitalist economies. Resembling the debate developed in the private sector, the convergent stance implies a uniform shift towards a liberalization pattern, which adversely affects the distributive outcomes associated with industrial relations institutions, including a deterioration in working conditions, unions disempowerment, and corrosion of the structure for collective representation. Nevertheless, the opposing assumption, which recognizes the resilience of distinct national institutional configuration, has been widely accepted from an employment relation perspective and further sustained by the extensive research that I really appreciated, coordinated by Lorenzo and Stephen. Also in this case, building on the theoretical and empirical contribution, a future research agenda could look at the more recent developments in this field. Yet from crisis to crisis, the resilience and the functioning of industrial relations institutions are put under severe strain. Common pressures linked to the pandemic urgency and the ongoing inflationary emergency could challenge the actual configuration of public services and the regulation of labor. We could wonder whether newly emerging settings in collective bargaining developments and employment relations leeway will be adopted across European countries to counter inflation trends, tackle salary issues, to govern new ways of work organization, also connected to remote working. Could the public sector, and specifically the public employment and the regulation of labor for its personnel, represent once again an area of intervention of government policies in response to economic and financial crisis? If so, in an expansionary or retrenchment direction? Can we expect that the resulting effects in terms, for instance, of the degree of unilateralisms versus social dialogue, degree of centralizations versus decentralization, to be superficial and transitory, or instead could they embody the preliminary stage of a fundamental transformation in the regulation of work in the public sector, such as to undermine its specific national character or configuration? These are some of the questions that Lorenzo's legacy could help to disentangle in the future. And just to conclude at this point, I like to finish by quoting a sentence, for me really important, from his 2008 Milestone article that says, to deliver more efficient and better quality services, in large measure through a reform of public service employment relations, requires more sophisticated and less unilateral mechanisms than those borrowed from moral hazard theory. This comprises not primarily and not only monetary incentives, market mechanisms and control, but also trust relationships, cooperation, professionalisms, a public service ethos, and the availability of voice options for the users. Thank you.
Thank you again, Stephen, Beppe, and Della, for these insights, overview of the insights that Lorenzo left us, and also the enduring legacy that I think will help us in advance in our analysis of employment relations in general and public administration in particular. I also think that you underlined well how, as you did now, and how the objective that Lorenzo had in mind was actually to improve public services and working conditions generally, and in the public administration in particular. So, and this was part of his commitment, actually, not only to investigate and to analyze, to understand what was going on, but also to contribute effectively with also close relations with actors in employment relations and in the public administration in order to make things better, to actually achieve the goals that someone else was trying to achieve by using new public management, for instance. I mean, sharing some of the goals, of course, the means were different. I mean, the tools that you had to use were radically, I would say, different. So thank you again. We still have some time if you wish to contribute to this part of our morning, if you want to raise any issues or to put forward any remarks. I wonder whether there are people who would like to contribute in this direction. Otherwise, we can just briefly, before the time break, this first session, we will have a coffee break, actually. And then in about half an hour, we can start again with the second session, which will be in Italian. And we will have the speakers that I mentioned before, Mimo Carrieri, Gianprimo Cella, and Ida Regalia. And we will have time in that session as well, if you want to share some thoughts or some memories, maybe, and we can discuss. And then I want to remind you that at the end of this morning, we will also have a small buffet. So if you want to stay with us and have a little conversation, we can do that, and I would be very glad if you stay. Thank you. So we can thank you again, Stephen. Beppe and Dana. So we have a break and we come back at 11:30. I also say that to our colleagues and friends who are connected online. We will be back in half an hour. Thank you.
Beppe was saying that I read too fast, but